Hello students, this is Professor Somonshi and welcome to our channel Also Polytechnic. So students, in today's video, we are going to see the memory allocation for objects. So let's start the session. So students, first we will see what is meant by memory allocation for objects. So whenever the object is created, the memory is allocated for the functions as well as some variables. So how much memory is allocated for member functions and how much memory is allocated for member variables that we are going to see. So first we will see the memory space for the objects. So students, when we declare the class, at that time, no any memory is allocated for the object. Means when we specify the class, memory space is not allocated for objects. That means when the object will get the memory, the object will get the memory when we create the object or when we declare the object. So here the memory space for object is allocated when they are declared. That means when we declare the object, at that time the memory space is allocated for the objects and not when the class is specified. That means if we only specify the class, at that time memory space will not be allocated. When will it get allocated? When the objects are created. Now the second point is the memory space for member functions. Now how much memory or in which manner the memory space will be allocated for the member functions that we are going to see. So students, actually the member functions are created and placed in the memory space only once when they are defined as a part of class definition. That means when we define the class and inside that class definition, we define the member function, at that time, the memory space is allocated for the member functions. That means member functions are created and placed in the memory. Means the member function gets the memory only when they are defined as part of class of definition. That means when the class is defined, at that time, the memory space is allocated. Now, since all the objects belonging to that class use the same member functions, that means suppose we have one class student and for that class student we have total 5 objects. So since all the objects belonging to one class student, no separate space is allocated for member functions, because suppose we have class student and in class student suppose we have 5 objects S1, S2, S3, S4 and S5. And now we have two functions, that is get data and put data. So all the objects are going to use those member functions get data and put data. And all the objects belonging to same class and the name of class is student. So that's why no separate memory space is allocated for the member function. Only common memory space is allocated for the member functions. Now the memory space for the member variables. That means how the memory space is allocated for the member variables. So students, each variable stores different value for different object. That's why there should be some different space for different member variable. When the object are created, only space for member variable is allocated separately for each object. Here we have seen no separate memory. For member function, separate memory is not allocated, but for the member variables, the separate memory space is allocated. Now, why this separate memory space for the variable is required? Why it is essential? So, separate memory location for the objects are essential. Why? Because the member variable will hold different data value for different objects. That means that suppose student S1 will have the different name, student S2 will have different name, student S3 will have different name. That means the variables of different objects will have the different values. So that's why for variables, for each object, the memory space is separately allocated. So here you can see. So suppose there are two member functions. This is member function 1. Here there is second member function, and here we have created object 1, object 2 and object 3. Now students, for member function 1 and member function 2, this all total memory will be allocated. Means no separate memory, common memory is allocated. So here common for all objects. Member function 1 and member function 2, the common memory space is allocated for object. So here memory created when the function is defined. When the member function get the memory, when the memory is created, when the member functions are defined. And in the similar way, in the third scenario we have seen, here there are three objects, object 1, object 2 and object 3. And there are two variables. So for object 1, member variable 1, member variable 2, separate memory. For object 2, for member variable 1, separate memory is allocated. For object 3, member variable 1, separate memory is allocated. In the similar way, for object 1, member variable 2, member variable 2, member variable 2. That means that separate memory space is allocated for the member variables. For each object, for object 1, member variable will get the separate memory. For this object 2, member variable 1 will get the separate memory. For this third object, the member variable 1 will get the separate memory. That means for variables, separate memory is getting allocated, but here for the member functions, the common memory space is getting allocated. So students, here we will once again revise the memory space for object, then the memory space for member function, and the memory space for member variable. So first, how the memory is allocated? So member space for variable, sorry, memory space for object, how it will be allocated? It will be allocated when they are declared. Means when we declare the class, at that time no memory will be allocated. But when we create the object, at that time memory will be allocated for the objects. Now, how the memory will be allocated for the member functions? So we have seen that what the member functions are created and placed in the memory space when they are defined as part of class definition. And again, what we have seen, since all the objects belonging to class use same member functions. That means suppose there are 5 objects, all the 5 objects are using the same member functions. That's why no separate memory space is allocated. The third is memory space for member variable. Since all the variables will hold different value for different objects, that's why it is essential to allocate the separate memory for separate memory variable for each object. So student, this is our scenario. Students, in this way, we have seen the memory allocation for objects, where we have seen the memory allocation for objects, the memory space allocation for member functions, and the memory space allocation for member variables. So students, if you have any doubts, you can write it in the comment section. Till then, thank you. Thanks for